Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 50. I'm the show's host, Kyle, and yes, this is episode 50. I am excited that the show has made it this long. I really wouldn't be continuing to do the show if it wasn't for people listening to the show and sharing the show, and the show having a growing audience is really the reason that I'm plugging away at this. I do enjoy doing the show. I'm glad that the knowledge the show is spreading. I feel like it's really important stuff that I get out to you in these shows, and that's why it's so important to listen and to share the shows. But if it wasn't for people listening, and absorbing the knowledge I'm putting out there, I just won't be making recordings of myself to store on the internet. So thank you to everybody who's listening. It's amazing. I'm having a lot of fun doing it. I hope to get to episode 100. And maybe for episode 100, I'll try to have like a really cool guest on the show or something like that. So if anybody has any suggestions on what I could do for episode 100, send me a message. Anytime, I'm welcome to emails or messages on Facebook. I would say the easiest way to get a hold of me is to message me on Kyle's Files on Facebook. I'll respond as soon as I get it. I actually had somebody message me this week and just give me some feedback on the show, telling me she liked the show, what she didn't like about the show. It's really helpful to hear that kind of stuff, so anybody who has that, I'm more than willing to listen. I actually had somebody else who listened to the show message me today and say that I really need to talk about the Qatar situation in today's show. So I guess we will kick off the show there and get episode 50 rolling with this whole Qatar situation. Now, for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, the recent news story started off when Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, and other countries all closed their borders, closed their ports, and closed their airports to Qatari citizens, planes, businesses, Qatari aircraft, boats, planes, what have you. And this occurred because Qatar, the state media, reported that the leader of Qatar thought that the Arab states shouldn't be looking for a war with Iran, which doesn't seem like a very extreme statement from my perspective. It seems pretty reasonable. The GCC, after all, which is the Gulf Cooperation Council that has 6 members, which are the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar, are having enough trouble with the war in Yemen. So it seems strange for so many of those countries to look to pick a fight with Iran, and Qatar saying, hey, look, like, we got our own stuff going on here. We don't need a war with Iran. That's not beneficial. Provoked a very negative reaction in the other GCC countries and then Egypt and other Arab and Muslim countries. Of course, there have been issues before. 3 or 4 GCC countries actually withdrew their ambassadors to Qatar in 2014. There's been a lot of, upset. A lot of these countries are upset with Bahrain's support of the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as their non-commitment to fighting a war with Iran. Now, the media spin on this story seems to be pretty interesting to me. They really seem to try to be taking this opportunity to glorify the Saudi government by saying, look, the Qataris, they support terrorism, and Saudi Arabia is trying to do the right thing by saying that we're not going to associate with Qatar anymore. But that's really not what caused the rift. The rift is caused by the support for Iran and the support for the Muslim Brotherhood. And so Egypt not liking Qatar supporting the Muslim Brotherhood made sense because, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood won a popular election in Egypt and then that government got overthrown. And so it's much more political and kind of self-righteous than the U.S. media likes to admit. They're really trying to portray it as, look at our useful allies over here in the Middle East doing us a favor. But that's not what's going on. Of course, Donald Trump came out and in a kind of a cryptic way took credit for what was happening in Bahrain or in Qatar and in the Middle East. Trump tweeted out that he told the Saudis that they had to kind of cut out the support for funding a jihad, and Qatar, being a known supporter for jihad, is a sign that they're taking this step. But it seems to me like if Saudi Arabia really wanted to help the fight against jihad, they would stop waging a war against the Houthis in Yemen and stop supporting the Taliban or the Al-Qaeda fighters in Yemen. Now, not all of the American media can obviously toe this line because of the left-wing media would have to at least give some acknowledgement to Donald Trump for making this happen if they want to do that. So they actually have spun the story to say that this was a Russian hack of the Qatari government I guess in an effort to draw a rift in between Qatar and the rest of the Middle East. Now, this seems to me to be completely ridiculous, and how anybody could run a story that would have this massive amount of international implications, right? Like, if Russia is hacking Qatar and putting fake news stories on their state media website in an effort to provoke a conflict between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, well, I mean, that's a very dangerous game. In a lot of ways, you can argue that it's a pretty hostile act. And so if that is going on, is a very serious charge. And the media just glancingly reports it. I mean, I read this amazing New York Times story this morning, and it tied the Iranian terrorist attack that occurred today that I'll talk about in a few minutes to this issue with Qatar. So it seems to me that the left-wing media is really, in any anti-Trump media, I guess establishment right-wingers are doing this too, where they're attacking Russia because they can't admit that Donald Trump made a right move, which isn't even a right move, but it's a right move in their worldview, where the U.S. needs this alliance with Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, I'm not sure what's going to happen here. I believe that Oman kind of takes the role of the mediator between all the other Arab nation states. Oman has tried to, initiate some conversations between Yemen and other Middle Eastern countries, trying to come to a resolution there. They're looking to come to a resolution here. I believe they've even tried to kind of bring a resolution to the whole Saudi Arabia-Iran thing. And I mean, I'm not trying to praise the government too much. I'm not sure, if this is coming from a place of genuine wanting to help, or if they benefit from this somehow, or they, really are just lying and only put on this hat or whatever. And so looking forward, I'm not sure what will happen. Maybe Oman will be able to open up the doors again, and everything could be okay between these neighboring states. Qatar is a very small country, kind of almost a boil off of Saudi Arabia, stretching into the Persian Gulf, a very rich nation. I mean, Qatar has a history and is known to have supported terrorism in the past and jihad in the past, and they've certainly been a problem in Syria supporting jihadist groups. So, I mean, there is something to be said for that. I just don't think that's the reason why Saudi Arabia and the other nations who close their doors with Qatar they're not doing it for the terrorism reason. They're doing it for their own political interest. And so now I guess I'll get into the Iranian terror attacks, so the reporting for the Iranian terrorist attacks started rolling in Wednesday morning East Coast time. The attack apparently involved, it sounds like, 2 groups of 4 jihadists each, including some women, at least 2 women I saw in reports where I identified going to a shrine to a very famous and important figure, and going to the Iranian parliament. Once there, wearing suicide vests and firing AK-47s, pistols, and hand grenades, were able to kill, it sounds like, between 7 and 12 people. I'm not sure if that number, I would guess that 12 may not be the cap, but the reports I've seen have said at the minimum of 7, at the most of 12 people were killed. ISIS early on claimed responsibility for the attack, and there's not too much dispute there. I guess the interesting part about the Iran story and the terrorist attack here, I think, is just kind of geopolitical implications of this attack. In the past, using the only possible evidence he could possibly think of, James Mattis has asserted that, ISIS never attacked Iran, as a way of saying that Iran must support ISIS in some way, when in reality Iran is fighting ISIS in both Iraq and Syria. And in Iraq, they're fighting ISIS on the side of the United States. And so this terrorist attack occurring in Iran certainly has some implications on how the U.S. sees Iran, and I think how maybe the West will see Iran. The West has developed this kind of culture of that we show solidarity with these other countries when terrorist attacks happen there. It certainly happened in even Afghanistan or France or even Russia to some extent, and so maybe this will help to bridge some ties between the West and Iran by showing to our civilians that their civilians go through terrorist attacks and live through that fear as well. This attack may provide the opposite, I think, of what ISIS would want for the change their terrorist attack would have the opposite result of what they want, and that is the West coming together with Iran and at least having something to bond themselves over, even if that thing is as terrible as a ISIS terrorist attack. I don't know. I mean, if that will happen, it'll depend, I think, a lot of it on just mainstream media reporting, and if they report this terrorist attack as what is a horrible tragedy against a civilian population, just like 9/11, just like the Paris terrorist attack, just like the terrorist attack in Melbourne and London that I'm about to talk about. All of these terrorist attacks are against oftentimes innocent civilians and people who did absolutely nothing wrong. There's a lot of American citizens who died on 9/11 who never understood that Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright starved 500,000 Iraqi children to death. And so none of the people in the towers that day were guilty of anything. Bill Clinton and the government was, but that caused the madmen of Al-Qaeda to lash out against the United States. And so, whether it's an Iranian or an American, I think the media should portray the victims of these attacks in the same sympathetic light, saying like, hey, these are completely innocent people going about their daily lives, and they were shot in the back by some absolute insane idiot who thinks it's a good idea to go out in public, kill as many civilians as possible, and then blow yourself up in the name of doing something right. Of course, this is probably an example of the Iranian government seeing some blowback for their actions in Iraq and Syria. The Iranian bad forces aren't known in any way to be upstanding people only fighting for the good. There's been a lot of reports of Shiite militias carrying out acts of torture and trying to displace populations to change demographics of areas, as for judicial killings, holding people and demanding confessions, and really just being terrorists to the Iraqi population. So I guess it should come as no surprise that an act like this would occur in Iran just because of the awful Iranian foreign policy, just like the really bad U.S. foreign policy leads to terrorism in the U.S. Off on a tangent, but getting back to where I was. So if the media portrays this the right way, maybe the U.S. civilians could start having some sympathy with the Iranian civilians. Both countries popularly elect their leadership, at least most of it in Iran, so the better our populations, the less hostilities that average Americans have towards average Iranians and vice versa, will allow the people to elect leaders that have the same feelings, and even if they don't actually believe it, at least have the same rhetoric. Maybe with some understanding too, the people in the West could look at Iran and kind of realize that just because the government's kind of crazy and says crazy things, not all the citizens are crazy and think crazy things. And so recent elections in Iran have really shown that Iran is moving in a more, I don't want to say liberal as in like our current understanding of liberal, just as in liberal as in smaller government restrictions and a less dangerous government in Iran. And that's at least to some extent what the current leader of Iran represents. So, and we'll also see that the media then reapproaches James Mattis and says, hey, Iran has now suffered a terrorist attack at the hands of ISIS. Does that mean that we should be helping the Iranians fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria rather than opposing them? I doubt we'll see that question. I just want to touch on 2 terrorist attacks that occurred overseas. That is in London, where 7 people died when 3 terrorists used a van to run over some people on the London Bridge, and then they hopped out and started stabbing people, killed a lot of 7 people, injured a lot more. I believe all 3 terrorists themselves were killed by police, but I'm not positive on that fact, if that is a fact or not. 2 of the terrorists who have been identified one as a Libyan and one as a Pakistani. Of course, the alt-right and then just the people who believe that terrorism is caused by Islam will say, look, 2 more Muslim majority countries, 2 more terrorists come from those countries. Obviously, we can't let those people from those countries come to the West. What I say is, look, 2 more countries where the U.S. has had significant intervention and killed a lot of innocent people and created a more disabled and less profitable world for people to live in these countries. So I think that's why it's going on. I want to talk quickly about splits within the anti-ISIS coalition. A lot of what I've speculated is that the splits in the anti-ISIS coalition will start to come apart as ISIS gets closer and closer to being run out of Iraq and Syria. However, these splits are coming between different countries. Germany is starting to move away from diplomatic relations with Turkey. I think a lot of this stems from the bad relationship between Merkel and Erdogan. And Qatar and Saudi Arabia were both involved in the anti-ISIS coalition, so this is another place where we see the split of countries who are in the coalition, but are no longer willing to work with each other, so that may cause some problems in the coalition. Of course, a lot of countries have really ramped down their roles in the coalition to fight ISIS, and it's mostly the U.S. in that coalition carrying out the bombings and everything now anyways. The State Department approved $1.4 billion in weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. This $1.4 billion is included within the $110 billion deal that Trump agreed to with Saudi Arabia. Of course, brave Senators Rand Paul and Chris Murphy are working to oppose the bill, so if there's anybody out there who wouldn't mind calling their senators and letting them know to support Murphy and Paul trying to block this deal, it's very important because the more weapons Saudi Arabia has, the more damage they get inflict on other Middle Eastern countries like Yemen. The U.S. Army is having to pay soldiers a lot more to enlist and re-enlist in the Army. The Army is struggling to fill their ranks since Trump pushed the number of soldiers to be in the Army up another 16,000. The Army, I guess, is far from all-time high levels, such as what we had during World War II, but the current levels are really high for, the United States being in what the government would refer to as a peacetime. I think, too, that the lack of people wanting to enlist in the Army kind of shows that the U.S. isn't involved in any interventions right now that are heavily supported by the public. If you look at what happened during World War II or 9/11, everybody was signing up to join the Army because they really believed in the mission. I don't think there's a mission that people in the United States really believe in right now. They kind of want to fight terrorism, but terrorism is an ideology, and who the hell could find it anyways? And every time you have to kill one of the jihadists, you end up killing 5 of the civilians, and you just create more jihadists anyways. So the Army's going to increase the amount of money they're giving to soldiers who enlist to bait them into joining. I think this also causes market distortions. I mean, if we look at this and look at what's going on, there's people who will elect to go to private industry but don't because the money coming from the Army is just so good. I think a lot of this money is being offered in signing bonuses too. If you look at who the Army's targeting, younger men and women who are probably more likely to make impulsive decisions, and $90,000 up front sounds really good. So I do think, this is concerning and probably drives very talented people away from private industry where they could create wealth and make a better world for everyone. Trump is taking steps to hide the torture report. He has demanded that all the copies of the torture report be returned to the Senate committee where the torture report was written. Of course, the torture report was written under Dianne Feinstein, I believe, and then she really took steps to spread out the torture report. I think this is more because she was spied on during her investigation of the torture report and her looking to put the pieces of the torture report together. And I shouldn't say she, because I'm sure she did very little of the work, but she, was in charge of the work being done. And by sending all these copies of the torture report out, it would make it impossible for the government to really stomp it out. But if you get all of the copies together and then you burn all of them, the torture report's gone forever, which would be really sad because there's a lot of incriminating evidence in there against a lot of people that are currently viewed in high regards and are looked up to when really they're war criminals. Speaking of war crimes, the Iraqi army is using white phosphorus within Mosul. White phosphorus is kind of like a smoke grenade type of weapon. I think it burns really heavy and it lays a smoke screen, so it could be good for allowing troops to move around in an open field or whatever. White phosphorus burns really hot and I guess gives off some kind of toxic smoke, so it's considered a war crime to use them in urban areas. I believe the U.S. has gotten in trouble for this before. Saudi Arabia did this in Yemen, and now we're having the Iraqi government do it within Mosul. The Iraqi government's first response to the claims that the video that they used the white phosphorus in Mosul was, oh yeah, we did, but it was only as a tactical move. We weren't using it as a weapon. We weren't trying to hit anybody with it. We were just using it to cover our troops as they moved around the city. And then they probably realized that, hey, that's still a war crime because, they don't know or they don't care. Then change their story to, we didn't do it, this didn't happen. Just lying to get out of it. Sad. Nobody's going to hold them to account. The U.S. won't withdraw any support for them, just like they won't withdraw any support from the Iraqi Special Forces unit that tortured and killed all those people. Some of the danger to using the white phosphorus within Mosul is that of the 2,000 civilians left in Mosul, about 100,000 of those civilians are children. And so if you think of just if it's a really hot, really dangerous, smoky object, it may be more dangerous to children than an adult with larger lung capacity. Also, you have the Iraqi government basically demanding that all the civilians leave the city. If there's this many children in the city, it's going to make it a lot harder for everybody to get out, just because it's so dangerous to exit the city with ISIS trying to kill anybody who leaves. And that has to be a very difficult decision to make if you have, 5 children. How do you lead those children into a possible dangerous scenario? The popular mobilization forces continue to advance on the Syrian border in Iraq, taking 9 more villages from ISIS. Of course, me and Will Porter talked about this in the last show, Foreign Policy Focus 49. Will outlined how the U.S. policy for the popular mobilization forces differs so much between Iraq and Syria, and just us wondering what's going to happen when those Iranian-backed forces cross over from the Iraqi side to the Shiite Syria side of the border. Will they still receive that same amount of assistance and love from the U.S., or will they then become enemies? Speaking of the U.S. attacking Shiite militias, the U.S. again attacked Assad-linked forces in southeast Syria in the desert there. This again was the forces moving towards Al-Taf, but not the Al-Taf base there, where there are about 150 U.S. soldiers stationed. The claim from the U.S. government is that they were in fear that these soldiers will advance and then put the U.S. soldiers in jeopardy. However, these Assad-backed troops are actually looking to fight ISIS in the area. So right now the U.S. is directly bombing a group of people trying to fight ISIS. That seems to me like you're fighting on the side of ISIS when you're doing that. It seems like an extremely stupid thing to do if you're an American and know that the one people who actually want to attack the Americans are not the Iranians, who made a deal with the United States not to develop nuclear weapons, but ISIS, who have been able to at least claim responsibility for terrorist attacks across the West. I've talked about this in past episodes, just about what it means for this attack to occur. It seems for now that Russia is just allowing this to happen. I guess some of the fear would be is that you never know if maybe there's Russian soldiers embedded with these forces. I mean, there are Russian soldiers embedded within Syria, so you never want to hit one of them. I'm sure it will be different whenever the U.S. is attacking Assad troops and not Iranian-backed troops. But, I mean, these troops are loyal to Assad, and they're working to fight the Al-Qaeda terrorists in Idlib and the ISIS terrorists in the rest of the country. And so why the U.S. would bother attacking these people when they could be attacking ISIS is really absurd to me. Did hear an interesting fact that the group being trained at the Al-Tanf base is actually a Kurdish group, and this is an anti-Assad Kurdish group, so they believe in fighting ISIS as much as they believe in fighting Assad. This just goes to show the absolute insanity of the U.S. policy that they still want Assad to go in Syria. After all this war, after all this bloodshed, after it was shown to them that if Assad goes, it's going to be Al-Qaeda or ISIS, they're still electing to fight a war and wage a war against Assad rather than against ISIS. I read a report today that 60% of the deaths that the Pentagon admits to in the fight against ISIS have occurred under Trump. One of two ways to take the story. The first is that Trump is killing a lot more civilians than Obama. The other is that Obama was a lot better at hiding civilians' deaths than Trump is. I'm not sure which it is. It does seem like there's more airstrikes being carried out in these countries since Trump took over. And there's been a lot of strikes on positions that definitely had a lot of civilians in them. So it seems like the rules of engagement have to have loosened a little bit since Trump took over. A U.S. coalition airstrike killed 21 civilians fleeing Raqqa. The civilians were looking to get out of the city. Of course, this is what the U.S. told the civilians to do. And so, again, if you are a civilian in Raqqa, your choice is either to stay put and possibly be bombed by the U.S. and continue to live under ISIS rule, which is extremely dangerous and could lead to your death, or your risk is to flee and then be either killed by an ISIS sniper or a U.S. bomb. So, I mean, you just don't have many good choices, and you have to wonder, like, what it just has to be like for one of these poor civilians. Quick story out of Libya, and that is the U.S. government is currently being attacked by pretty much all sides in Libya. The government of General Haftar, that is backed by Russia and the UAE, is currently fighting against the U.S. and UN-backed government. the Haftar government has some sort of alliance or at least an agreement to mostly fight the US-backed government with the third government in Libya that I'm not sure how much international backing it has. It has a parliament set up and perceives some legitimacy in some large portion of Libya. The other issue is that ISIS has taken advantage of the US-backed government fighting the Haftar government and has started fighting the US-backed government, I guess, trying to seize more territory while they're weakened on the defensive. Just want to update the story about the Ivory Coast mutiny that I talked about a couple weeks ago. The mutiny has apparently ended and the government agreed to pay out the soldiers the bonuses that they agreed to pay them. Last story I have is that the U.S. government gave the Philippines $150 million worth of weapons, mostly small weapons, grenades, M4, stuff like that, to help them to fight ISIS. Of course, ISIS continues to control at least a small portion of the city of Marawi in the Philippines there. And so there you have it for episode 50 of Foreign Policy Focus. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'd love any feedback that you have to give, anything that you could let me know that can help me to improve the show. I'm always welcome to hear it. I hope everybody shares the show. Sharing the show is so important to helping the show to grow. The show will grow the more you share it. Just want to get that point clearly across. Other things I need to tell you. You can find me on Twitter at KYAAALE. I'm on Facebook at Kyle's Files. Files is spelled F-Y-L-E-S. You can also join the private Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus. You could also find me at kylesfilesblog.com and the libertarianinstitute.org. Thanks everybody for listening. I really appreciate it. 50 episodes down and I'll be back on Friday.